Now, a small aside, policymakers, politicians, employers have assumed, it turns out erroneously, that skill once created remains forever. And we have data by comparing the 1994 and 2003 assessments that large percentages of Alberta adults found a way to lose the skills some of the skills that the education system imparted. The red line is the 1994 skill average at each age level, and the blue line is for the same people 9 years later. And the gap between the two lines suggests the magnitude of skill loss that's occurred. We interpret this economically as a sign that the demand for the use of literacy skills in jobs is not sufficient to cause people to maintain them. This is a bad result economically because it denies the economy the benefit of those skills that it invested heavily to create in the first place. And so it reinforces what we said earlier, a need to pay attention to the demand side to willfully create knowledge and skill-intense jobs. We now turn this argument about utilization and press it farther and farther down. This first series of charts looks at different kinds of Aboriginal workers in the province of Alberta. The first one relates to band members living on reserve, and we're comparing the skills of workers at each of those levels with the demands of the jobs that they're in. The first chart is very revealing and reveals a pattern that repeats itself throughout the different population subgroups. First point is that there are way more level 1 and 2 people than there are jobs at level 1 and 2 for those adults to inhabit. By extension, there are shortages of level 3 people and level 4 people and level 5 people. There are jobs for those people, but they don't have the skills to meet the occupational demands of those occupations. If we turn to band members off reserve, the problem is somewhat less dramatic than the on-reserve population, but still the same pattern. Surpluses of people at level 1 and 2, shortages of people to fill jobs at level 3, 4, and 5 that already exist. So we have a misfit in the labor market, and that misfit is costly economically. Any steps taken to balance that more would be good by giving people skills to fill level 3, 4, and 5 jobs. We now push the utilization story down to the level of the actual individual. The question at hand is, do the individuals have the skill to meet the demands of the occupation in which they're working? And unfortunately, the answer is, in Alberta, no. Half of all workers have literacy skills below the occupational demand. About a little better than 30% have exactly the level needed by their job, which is not such a good thing because it provides no cushion for those workers to meet rising skill demands, and we saw earlier that skill demand is rising rapidly. And finally, a little less than 20% of workers have literacy skill shortages that represent untapped economic potential if you could create jobs to use those skills. So there's a serious misfit between the demands of the labor market and the skills of the workers. If we turn to the Aboriginal population in Alberta, we first look at band members on reserve. They are actually 10% more likely to be in literacy skill shortage, so relatively less skilled than the non-Aboriginal population, and less likely to be in balance or in surplus in terms of their skills. The situation in off-reserve Aboriginal populations in the province is much the same, about a 10% greater disadvantage, more likely to be in shortage, and less likely to be in balance and surplus. If we summarize what that means, in the labor market, employers hire the most skilled and leave the least skilled behind. And so in a competitive labor market, like we've seen the Canadian one is, Aboriginal workers will be systematically selected into unemployment, and when they get unemployed, they'll earn lower wages and get less access to adult education and training on the job. So this will accumulate into an economic disadvantage that is punishing for them as individuals and for the economy as a whole. So now we're going to turn to, if this is such a problem and one that affects Aboriginal people more than the general population, what is it we need to know about shortages? What would we need to do to eliminate any skill shortages that are constraining the performance of the economy? What would those interventions cost? And finally, what economic benefits would ensue from making the investment? We'll start with the actual numbers. 81,000 out of the 126,000 Aboriginal workers in Alberta are in literacy skill shortage. Their skills are below the level demanded by the occupations in which they work. That's the bad news. It's a very high percentage. The good news is that most of those workers are in literacy segments C and D. So these are people who aren't the traditional illiterate. They can read, they just can't read well enough to master tasks at level 3, where most of the jobs are. So relatively focused interventions embedded in workplace training, health and safety training, or skill upgrading would in fact solve their problem. So large numbers of Aboriginal workers with a reasonably small level of problem. When you take that information on who needs help and how much help they need to help them eliminate their own specific problem, you come up with a bill for band members in the province of about 110 million, split roughly equally among on and off reserve populations, and an additional $80 million needed to eliminate occupational literacy skill shortages in the Métis and other Aboriginal populations. So the bottom line is fixing the problem is going to take a lot of money. The happy news is if we're one to fix the problem, the returns in terms of higher earnings would be quite spectacular. Our estimates are that they would earn returns of somewhere between 200% and 300%, depending on the population, its location, and their specific needs of different groups in different parts of the population. These are rates of return on public investment that haven't been seen for a couple of 100 years when people decided they needed to put sewers and water systems into the City of London in England. So there is an economic calculus and a human calculus that says investing to solve the literacy problem generally and specifically in Aboriginal populations is worthwhile. I'm going to turn now to showing you data on where the problem actually is using a couple of illustrations. The first is a picture of Calgary on the percentage of people with level 1 and 2 skills. So notionally the people that are most in need of literacy upgrading. The green areas are the areas that have the smallest number of these people. The orange and red are the areas that have the highest needs. And so you can see even in a place like Calgary, there's huge variability from neighborhood to neighborhood. And this gives policymakers an idea of where to invest their money and people delivering literacy services where those services are most needed, where they market, where they put their service delivery points. A second product ranks communities in Canada on all of these variables I've been talking about. We'll use the city of Calgary to illustrate this. The economic demand for Calgary is high. They get an A grade. They're 28th out of 328 communities, so sitting right at the top of literacy skill demand. So the unavoidable conclusion is that jobs in Calgary are knowledge and skill intense. You can draw on a pool of 250 million literacy points, and the employed workers in the province have skill levels at an average score of 298. This is well above the 275 threshold that defines level 3, where we think we need to be to compete. You're using 75% of the available skill supply, which is remarkable. Alberta, as a province, has the highest utilization of the entire country at 71%, and the national average is 66%. So people in Calgary work really hard. And if you think of literacy as an economic asset that we need to use, you're doing a good job. On the negative side, there's very little growth to be had by pushing that higher above 75%. If we turn to the cost and benefit side, given the nature of the literacy problem that workers in Calgary demonstrate, it would take $347 million investment to give them the skills they need to do their jobs well. That's about $1,200 a learner, so it's a fairly steep investment. But that investment would yield $2 billion more a year in earnings, about $6,400 per learner. And if we found a way to use the literacy surpluses that are evident in the city, you'd get another $636 million in earnings. The net result with these investments would make Calgary wealthier, the citizens wealthier, and provide a bigger tax base upon which to fund social services and other things that are supported with through public finance. A second example is the city of Edmonton. And here, again, you see a different pattern where green is good, orange and red are bad, and literacy problems in Edmonton are quite concentrated spatially. So some neighborhoods have lots of problems, others fewer. Again, the story is this is information that policymakers and program delivery people can use to focus their efforts where they'll have the biggest impact. Edmonton, like Calgary, is rated at grade A. They're 59th in the scorecard against 328 communities, large metropolitan areas. They have 238 million literacy points, an average score of 296 for the average employed worker in Edmonton. Again, very high, up in level 3, and they're using 72% of the available supply, less than Calgary, but still in national terms well above the average. In terms of costs and benefits, an investment of $33 million would eliminate occupational literacy skill shortages in the city, about $1,200 per learner. That would be expected to precipitate an increase each year following the investment of $2 billion in additional earnings. It would put $6,300 more in the pocket of every learner and every worker in the city. And finally, using up the surpluses that go unused in the Edmonton economy would generate another $549 billion of earnings in the city, increasing the tax base and giving citizens a higher quality of life, inevitably. So by way of summary, the story I've told you is literacy is fundamentally important to social and economic growth in Canada. It defines our rate of productivity growth and hence the growth of GDP per capita more than any other factor that one might consider. It also is responsible for creating most of the social inequality in all of the things that we value: employment, wages, health, and levels of social engagement. It also constrains, if there's lots of low-skilled people, the return on investment we get from our tax investments. And one can imagine serving a more literate population might allow you to get more for those investments, or in fact get the same return we do now for a lower cost. And finally, for Aboriginal peoples, the evidence and the theory suggest that having literacy skills that allow you to engage with the dominant culture give you a means to control your own language and culture and to participate fully and fairly that no other tool provides. So literacy and solving Canada's literacy problems is fundamental to the future of our economy and society. Thank you. Want to know more about literacy? Go to any of the following websites shown on the screen: the website for Data Angel, the website for Statistics Canada, the website for Bow Valley College, or the website for the Canadian Council on Learning. You'll find out about how important literacy is to Canada's future economic competitiveness and our collective well-being.